The society we live in today is vastly different from the one where women first started playing football. The first recorded official football match took place on the 9th of May 1881 in Scotland. Since then, women have gained the right to vote, the marriage bar that prohibited married women from applying for job vacancies got lifted, so on and so forth. However, till this day, women's presence in football continues to provoke a hateful and misogynistic response from those that still believe that sport is a male-dominated space. And why is that? Clearly, the oppressive views of a woman's role in society and where she belongs still exists. And this is not just on the field. The idea of a woman playing sports, it being profitable, and people being interested in it is still considered impossible by some. Despite a century of setbacks and bans, women have continued to strive for change on both political and societal levels. Women's football is slowly starting to receive the investment and support it deserves, yet it continues to face disproportionate criticism despite the battles for women's right to play football having already been won. Let's dive in. Although the first recorded women's football game was back in 1881, it wasn't until the First World War that the women's game started to gain popularity, and this completely changed the narrative for the sport. During World War I in the UK, which started in 1914, many men were drafted into the military, leaving a shortage of workers in many industries. Although women were already working at the time, they were encouraged to take up jobs in industries that were previously reserved for men. Within a short space of time, the UK saw its first female police officers, women started working in the transport industry. In 1915 there was a high demand for women to work in munitions, and in 1916 the WAAC, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, was established to replace the jobs being done by soldiers in the war. During all of this, military hospitals started to run low on funds, so they approached these munition factories with the idea to play football and raise money for charity. Football then started to get promoted among female workers due to the positive effects it had on your physical and mental health, and rightly so. So with that, munition factories started forming their own women's football teams, the most popular one being the Dig Care ladies team based in Preston. Along their journey, they started to attract really large crowds for their exhibition matches, their first one being held on Christmas Day with 10,000 supporters. Obviously, the women got the football bug. Allow me to interrupt you for a second. Answer this question for me in one word. Why do people watch sports? If you said entertainment, then you're correct. The overarching reason why people watch sports is because it's fun. And the same applies back then. In the book A Woman's Game, Susan Rack points out that British newspaper archives actually reveal how fast this change in the uptake of women's football came about. Between 1913 and 1915, women's football games were mentioned 8 times a year on average. In 1916, it increased to 23 mentions, followed by 318 in 1917 and 276 in 1918. With the thought of entertainment in mind, let's set the scene a little bit. Nearly every person at the time was affected by the war. People were losing their husbands, their fathers, their brothers. So women's football started to become popular because it provided a much needed space away from that harsh reality. Fast forward a few years, and once the war was over and men returned to the workplace and the football pitch, the entertainment that the women's football game provided, the money that was raised for war charities, and the effort that these women put in to keep society functioning at the time was crumpled up and thrown out the window. The men at the time had an issue with the newfound independence that women found through work and through sport. This eventually led to what is commonly known, or not so commonly known, as the ban on women's football. Just over 2 years after the war ended, men's football was back in action and women's football was still going strong. On the 26th of December 1920, Dig Care ladies beat St. Helens 4-0 in front of a crowd of 53,000 people. They raised £3,000, which is now equivalent to £140,000 for the unemployed and wounded soldiers. Suddenly there was a competition between men and women as more people were attending women's games. This trajectory didn't sit right with people within the FA that started started to make it harder for women to play, and they only allowed games to be held with their permission. Throughout the year, the women's team started to play for charities other than those affected by the war, namely for political and working class causes, which were labelled as anti-establishment. I know. How dare they? The increase in complaints unfortunately led to December 5th, 1921, when the FA voted to bar women from playing on FA-affiliated grounds, deeming it unsuitable for women's bodies and inappropriate for women's morale, as they should be focusing on their domestic duties. Let's be real, we all know why this happened. A competition started between the men's game and the women's game, and the women were getting bigger crowds. On Christmas Day in 1920, the Everton men's team played against Arsenal over in Goodison Park in front of 35,000 people, and yet 53,000 people flocked over to the same park the next day to watch Dick Kerr ladies beat St. Helens. The observation here is that the women's game was damaging the men's game, which it wasn't, because this is sport we're talking about. It's supposed to be fun. The more people that enjoy it, the better. But regardless of this, the men in power did what they usually did. They stopped another group other than themselves from what? Succeeding. Are we surprised? Come closer. No. Regardless, the golden era of women's football was over, and this changed the narrative for the women's game forever. For the next several decades, women's football became an underground scene, as some clubs and players kept playing despite the ban. Fast forward to 1967, when 19-year-old Patricia Gregory asked her local newspaper why women didn't play football. The outcome wasn't exactly what she expected, as women came forward asking to join her non-existent team. Patricia quickly found out about the ban after she applied to her local council to use a pitch and was rejected. She was trying to form a club and was met with problems wherever she went. Out of frustration, she again wrote back to the local paper, explaining the issues she faced, and one men's team from Tottenham offered her to use their training grounds, and that is where her team White Ribbon was formed. Clearly, Gregory was relentless and didn't take no for an answer, and by 1968, the local council actually agreed to let her hire a pitch. Although many outlets say that the ban was lifted in 1971, Patricia actually says that it was lifted in 1969, but there's no official record of it because it wasn't something that was celebrated. In Patricia's words, there was no flash of light or anything like that. I wish I could tell you there was great excitement, but there wasn't. We just solved each problem as it came, one by one. Female athletes have always had to fight tooth and nail for themselves and their teammates. Despite these remarkable women possessing incredible physical abilities, being a female athlete, unfortunately, isn't all about winning medals and trophies. Whether it's for the right to play or to have your own kit or quality training, women in football have to constantly fight for their right to be taken seriously and their right to equal treatment in sports. They have to deal with gender discrimination, pay disparities, unequal media coverage, lack of investment and sponsorship, and other systemic issues that still plague the sports industry. There's a lot at play here, and speaking out is not an easy road to take either. In many cases, these women have to make tough choices between staying silent and keeping their spot on a team, something they've worked very hard for, or speaking up and risking their chance to play at an elite level. Women's football is just not taken seriously because of that age-old boring clapback that young men's teams would beat them. Let's talk about it. Female athletes often face an unfair comparison to men, leading to a lack of recognition for their abilities for the sake of a headline that will definitely stir the pot. It's as if people choose to forget that women compete against other women, yet they are still subjected to the scrutiny that men's teams are inherently superior because physiologically, men's bodies are different to women's bodies. Hence, the division in the first place. Besides the point going over people's heads for the sake of an empty argument. It's a pity that these are the points that are being brought up, rather than acknowledging the fact that men have had access to more resources, more opportunities, and support for their athletic pursuits than their female counterparts. Also, let's not forget why the women's football ban even happened in 1921. Women's football was on the trajectory to becoming something great, something that everyone enjoyed. In saying that, even if the ban didn't happen and men's sports and women's sports were left to their own accord, it's important to distinguish that women's football is different from men's football and should be evaluated for its own merits and vice versa, rather than constantly being compared. And what do they say about comparison? It's the thief of joy, and it truly is. Because again, this is sport we're talking about here. These players, regardless of their gender, have unique skills and styles of play and physical abilities that deserve to be appreciated and celebrated on their own terms. People need to understand that the reason why the women's game is different from the men's game is because it is. Shocker, women are physiologically different to men, so they will play the game differently. This situation is similar to someone saying that Usain Bolt is not an impressive athlete because a horse can run faster than he does. It's silly, it has no substance, and it doesn't address anything whatsoever. On another yet more important note, we're at a stage now where the FA is, and I quote, trying to right the wrongs of nearly a century of neglect. Those decades of underfunding, lack of support, even active opposition came alongside changes in how women view their bodies, health, exercise, competitive sport, and the further genderizing of sport. Attitudes to women in football, sport, and in society more generally had not progressed in a straight line. This is going to sound very simple, but women are not men in a woman's body. Women have suffered and are still suffering from the consequences of what is termed as bikini medicine, which is an outdated, sexist belief that women's health only differs to men in the parts of women that bikinis cover. Do you need proof? Take a look at all the female professional football players that are dropping like flies with ACL tears. Only 6% of sports science is dedicated to women. No wonder it's still a mystery why this happens. Regardless, the pink it and shrink it approach needs to go. A common solution that is proposed by the geniuses on social media to address these issues is the almighty women need to support other women. And there you have it. The problem is solved. Really, if you find yourself agreeing with that statement, I'm gonna stop you right there now. I've got 2 questions to ask you. Number 1, do you agree that guilting people into doing something that you don't want to do is right? Yes or no? Okay, cool. Now question number 2. With your answer in mind, do you still agree with the overall sentiment of the argument? No? I thought so. And look, if you agree with this statement, or if you've said it before, I'm only pulling your leg. The approach is rational and technically true. Women's sport needs more support, and we can't ignore the fact that a better job engaging women has to be done. I'd like to point you to a global study done by YouGov that identified that men that watch men's professional sports actually watch women's professional sports 3% more than women who do. But before we get ahead here and make it into a competition, we need to look at the 58% of women that don't watch sports at all. As we now know, women, whether they are athletes or fans, haven't been particularly celebrated in this space. So of course it would be amazing if there's a safe space for women that can enjoy sports without the constant teasing and intimidation. But there are other barriers in place that have massively impacted the low consumption of women's sports. According to the survey, 40% of respondents feel that the main reason why they don't watch women's sports is a lack of media coverage. 35% of those surveyed cited a lack of knowledge about the teams, while 30% cited limited marketing as another factor. These issues are coined as supply-side issues, rather than the ordinary social media comment section that says that it's the physicality, speed, and low quality of women's sport being the reason why people don't tune in.
Broadcasters, especially public broadcasters funded by taxpayers' money, should put their action behind their words, because they rightfully criticize football organizations or other sports organizations for not paying equally women and men, or not having the same prize money. Well, we need to generate these revenues, and they should help us, because otherwise we'll simply not sell these rights at these undervalued prices to them. And, well, the European public will not be able to watch the Women's World Cup.
As you can see here, there's a chicken and an egg construct between publishers and advertisers in the context of women's sports coverage. Media companies are hesitant to cover women's sports events or provide adequate airtime to them because there is this presumption that advertisers are not interested in sponsoring them. At the same time, advertisers are reluctant to invest in women's sports because there's not enough media coverage or audience interest to justify the cost. This situation has created a vicious cycle where a lack of media coverage and investment in women's sports leads to a lower level of public interest, which in turn makes advertisers and media companies less willing to invest in women's sports. You see where I'm going with this? The lack of agreement between the two and frankly this belief that people actually care is stunting the growth of women's sports. So what happens instead?
There's a stark difference between how we see female athletes on the field versus how we see them in the media. And in fact, given the overall lack of coverage of women's sports in the media, we're more likely to see female athletes in their bikini than on the field in action. And the messages that are sent to viewers in these images differ in very dramatic ways.
The quality of reporting isn't even exciting, so what do you expect? Pity views. I'll speak on behalf of the athletes here. Women do not want your pity. They want action, and mainstream media aren't paying attention. So people have to think outside the box. In the book Game On, Sue Antis says, with coverage of women's sport growing in the past decade, it appears that new media is succeeding where traditional print did not. Well-respected websites and podcasts dedicated to women's sport are generating large followings, often created in direct response to the lack of coverage in traditional print and broadcast media. In fact, Leigh Moore, former FA digital marketing manager of the Women's Super League and England women's team, said something impactful about this. Let's not rely on others to write headlines for us. Let's write our own headlines. And that is how the Lionesses tag began in 2012, along with the digital-first approach that women's teams across the world started to implement in order to get more eyes on women's football. Through the efforts of people like Leigh Moore, audiences' interests in women's sports started and continues to be on the rise, despite the coverage imbalance. If people are willing to believe that women's sports can be profitable, there is potential for investment, given that the audience already exists. The points being made here are easy. Women's sports needs to be visible, it needs to be advertised, and it needs to be accessible. Once we meet these three standards, it's fair game. We can all agree that women's football is capturing hearts and minds like never before. In the UK, the average viewing time per person for women's sport on TV increased by a whopping 131% in 2022. Across the pond, the NWSL just sold the rights for a new team at a record-breaking price, with 125 million set to be invested in the Bay Area franchise. The Euro 2022 final was matched by a peak audience of 17.4 million people, making it the most watched women's football game on UK television. But the real kicker? 3 of the top 5 most attended football matches in Europe were women's games. You heard that right. The 2022 Euro final, with a record crowd of 87,192 supporters at Wembley. An El Clasico, Barcelona versus Real Madrid, with 91,553 people in attendance, and Barcelona again versus Wolfsburg, with 91,648 people showing up. If you got to the end of this video and you still think that investing in women's sports seems like a risk, and if you're still doubting whether women's football has a future, then it's time for you to, pardon the pun, kick that notion to the curb. Numbers don't lie, and they're telling us that the audience for women's football and women's sports is growing every day. Women's football is clearly standing on the shoulders of giants. And while the road ahead is still long, women's football is now at a point where men's football was years ago. And even with the pressure and with the constant criticism, these remarkable athletes continue to shine and to put on remarkable performances time and time again. And after all of this, for anyone that wants to leave a comment that says no one's watching or who cares, there's nothing left to say. In the words of Professor Majo Jane, saying that doesn't mean that no one is interested. It only means that you're not interested. And regardless of your personal interests, things are changing. And for the better.